Good morning, my dear students. Today's lesson is about adaptation and diversity of living organisms. Adaptation of living organisms to cope with the environmental changes, such as climate change, food diversity, existence of water. For example, camel's limbs. Camel's pad end with thick flat pad to wander through the hot desert sand. So when I ask you, give reason. Camel's pad, camel's limbs end with thick flat pad. Give reason to wander through hot desert sand. And also horse limbs end with strong solid hoof. Horse hoof end with strong solid end or strong solid hoof. Give reason to help the horse to go through rocky soil. Adaptation. What's meant by adaptation? It is a modification of living organisms' behavior, body structure, or biological function. Again, adaptation, it is a modification of living organisms' behavior, body structure, or organs' biological function to become more adapted to environmental condition which it lives in. There are three types of adaptation. Number one, structural adaptation, or it has another name which is anatomical adaptation. Number two, functional adaptation. Number three, behavioral adaptation. Again, types of adaptation: structural adaptation, functional adaptation, behavioral adaptation. At the first, we will talk about structural adaptation or anatomical adaptation. It is adaptation that studies the structure of one body living organ. For example, horse hoof structure or camel's pad. Again, structural adaptation, it is a modification in the structure of one of body organ of living organism. Give reason to cope with the environmental condition. To cope with the environmental condition. For example, camel's pad structure and horse hoof structure. As I said, structural adaptation has another name which is anatomical adaptation. Number two, the second type of adaptation is functional adaptation. It is adaptation of some organs and the tissue to do a specific function. So, this is functional adaptation. It is adaptation of organs and the tissue to do a specific function. Functional adaptation. For example, secreting sweat in human in case of high temperature. Sometimes in high temperature, the skin do additional function which is secreting sweat or secreting poison in snakes. Behavioral adaptation. It is adaptation in the activity of some animals in different times of the day life. It is a modification or it is adaptation in the behavior of living organisms at a specific time of day or year. For example, birds migration. It occurs in a certain time of the year, and we will study birds migration later. Or activity of birds during daylight and the bats at night. Now we will study reasons of adaptation. Give reason. Some animals make adaptation to get food or to escape from their enemies or to move in different environments to get food from the surrounding environment or to escape from their enemies in danger situation. At the first, we will study adaptation in mammals. At the first, we will talk about adaptation in animals, then we will talk about adaptation in plants. The first point we will talk about adaptation in animals is adaptation and motion in mammals. As we know that mammals, most of them have forelimbs and back limbs. We will talk about forelimbs. Mammals live in various environments, so they move in different ways. Some mammals walk, fly, swim, or climbing and diving. Although the limbs of mammals are structured with similar bones, they have nearly the same bones or similar bones. Some modification happen to these limbs. Give reason to match with the way of movement and the animal's lifestyle, or to match with dominant environmental condition according to the environment where they live. So give reason, some forelimbs or some bones of mammals are modified. Give reason to match with the way of movement and to match with the environmental condition. At the first, we will talk about some examples. I said, we will talk about modification in some mammals' front limbs to move in different ways that match with their environment. For example, whale, dolphin, and sea lion. The front limbs are modified to become pedals or fin-like structure. The front limbs are modified into pedals or fin-like structure for swimming, and this is a kind of structural adaptation. Bats, the front limbs are modified into wings. Give reason for flying, to perform function of flying, and this is also a structural adaptation. Horse, the front limbs are modified into legs, or as we said before, strong solid hoof for running or running in the rocky soil. The last example is the forelimbs or front limbs of monkeys and gorillas. Forelimbs or front limbs are modified into long arms. They have long arms and elongated fingers, or elongation. What did happen? Elongation of bones of the front limbs and fingers. Give reason to perform function of climbing trees and catch things. So monkeys and gorilla, the long arms are due to elongation of the bones of the front limbs and fingers. Give reason to perform the function of climbing trees and catching things. And all of these types are structural adaptation. And also camel's pad, as we said before, that camels have thick flat pad to wander through the hot desert sand. Second, we will talk about adaptation and nature of food in birds. We are talking about adaptation in animals. The second point, we will talk about adaptation and the nature of food in birds. Birds are adapted to get food by beaks and legs. We will talk about the modification of birds' beaks and legs, which are adapted to the food type, the way of movement, and the environmental condition. At the first, we will talk about predatory birds. Predatory birds, they are birds which eat meat. They are birds which feed on meat. For example, hawk and vulture. Hawk and vulture. We will talk about the modification of beaks and the modification of legs. At the first, modification of beaks. They have strong, sharp, crooked beaks. They have strong, sharp, crooked beaks. Give reason to enable them to tear the prey's flesh. What is the meaning of tear the prey's flesh? It means to cut the prey's meat. So, beaks of the hawk and vulture, which are predatory birds, they feed on meat. They have strong, sharp, crooked beak. Give reason to tear the prey's flesh, or I can say to cut the prey's meat. Also, there is a modification of legs. They have four bendable fingers. They have four bendable fingers, ending with strong, sharp claw. They have four fingers. The three interior or front fingers. They have three interior or three front fingers, and one posterior or back. So modification of legs. They have four bendable fingers, ending with strong, sharp claw. Three interior. What are the meaning of interior? Front, and one is posterior or back. Give reason: to control pouncing the prey or to control catching the prey. The second type of birds, they are birds which move or walk in the shallow water. For example, heron and hippo. Birds that feed on worm and snail, and they walk in the shallow water. Birds feed on worms and snail of shallow waters. For example, as I said, heron and hippo. Beaks, they are long, thin beaks. Give reason: to pick up worm and snail. Because the worms and snails, they are very small, so they need long and thin beaks. And the legs, they have long, thin legs ending with thin fingers. Why? To walk in the existence of water. As I said, they move in the shallow water, so they will walk in the existence of water. The last example is water birds. Water birds like duck and geese. Birds feed on fish like water birds, duck and geese. Duck and geese, they have beaks which are wide and indented beaks from the two sides. Why? Because when duck and geese feed on the fish, they may swallow a big amount of water, so their beaks help them to filter the food from water. The beaks of ducks are wide indented beaks from the two sides to help them filter the food from water, and their legs are palm legs to help them in swimming. If we look at our book, this is the legs of the ducks and geese. They have palm legs to swim in the water, and they have wide indented beaks from the two sides to filter the food from water. Take care that heron and hippo, they have long thin legs to walk in the water, but duck and geese, they have palm legs to swim in the water. So heron and hippo walk in the existence of shallow water, but duck and geese, they swim in the existence of water, or swim in the water. So modification of birds' beak and legs are adapted to the food type and the way of movement. Now we will talk about adaptation in plants. Adaptation of plants, there are some kinds of plants which are called predaceous plants or insectivorous plants, or you can say insect-eating plants. They are called predaceous, insectivorous, insect-eating plants. They are plants which they are like all plants, they are autotrophic or self-feeding. What is the meaning of autotrophic or self-feeding? They make their own food by photosynthesis process. As we studied before, that all kinds of plants make photosynthesis process. They take carbon dioxide, sunlight, and water and mineral salts from the soil to make their own food. What is the kind of this food? It's called carbohydrates. We studied before that plants make photosynthesis process. Photosynthesis process. They take plants take carbon dioxide, sunlight, and they absorb water and mineral salts from the soil to make photosynthesis process to produce oxygen and they make their own food. What is the type of this food? Carbohydrates. Carbohydrates. But these plants can't make protein because they need nitrogenous substance to make protein. They need nitrogenous substance to make protein. And as we said, in photosynthesis, plants absorb carbon dioxide. But there are some plants like predaceous plants or insectivorous plants. They can absorb nitrogenous substance from insects to make protein. Again, these plants, they are like all kinds of plants, they are autotrophic or self-feeding. Plants are self-feeding or autotrophic green plants because they can perform photosynthesis process. So they can make carbohydrates. The food of photosynthesis is called carbohydrates. They can't make protein because they can't absorb nitrogenous substance needed to make proteins from the soil. But what will insectivorous plants do? Some parts of these plants, like the leaves, are modified or adapted and modified to pounce and capture the insects, then digest them. They pounce, they capture and digest the insects. The leaves are modified, and this kind of adaptation is structural adaptation because the shape of the or the structure of the leaves are modified so they can catch insects, then absorb the nitrogen substance from the insects that help them to make protein. So they absorb nitrogen substance that their bodies need to make protein. For example, Dionia, Drosera, and Halophila. Dionia, Drosera, and Halophila. We can see their pictures in our book, Drosera, Dionia, and Halophila. And this kind of adaptation is called structural adaptation because the structure of the leaves is modified into a different structure which help them to catch the insects. Now we will talk about adaptation and the environment. Adaptation and the environment. We will take some examples, some forms of adaptation of living organisms with the environmental change. We will take some examples, for example, hibernation, aestivation, birds migration, and camouflage. At the first, we will talk about hibernation. Hibernation is a behavior adaptation. As we studied before, that there are three types of adaptation: structural, functional, and the behavioral adaptation. Hibernation is a behavioral adaptation. It is a behavior through which some animals dormant or stop moving and stop most of their vital activities to avoid the low temperature in winter. So give reason, some animals make hibernation to avoid the low temperature in winter or decrease in temperature. In winter, when temperature is decreased, some animals hide in burrow. They make burrow, hide themselves in burrow, such as some reptiles and insects, or some of them bury themselves in mud and stop feeding and their activities are decreased, such as frogs and toads, which are types of amphibians. Give reason to overcome the decrease in temperature. But will they stop their activities forever? No, of course. In the spring, when the environmental condition becomes favorable, these organisms return back to their normal activity. These organisms will return back to their normal activity, and as I said, this is a behavioral adaptation. So some reptiles and insects make a burrow, hide themselves in burrow, and some of them hide themselves in mud and stop feeding, like frogs and toads, which are types of amphibians. Now we'll talk about estivation. Estivation occurs in the summer, hibernation in the winter, but estivation in the summer. Estivation when the temperature rises up, especially in desert area, when there is a shortage of water and rain. Living organisms face an extreme rising in temperature and shortage in rain and water. Estivation, it is also a behavior through which some animals dormant and stop most of their vital activities to avoid extreme rise in temperature. It's very hot in summer and a shortage of water and rain. For example, jerboa, which is from rodents, animals, desert snail, and some insects. In estivation, these organisms become dormant and hide in humid burrow. They try to search for a humid burrow because it's very hot, or it's very high temperature or extreme rising in temperature, in order not to be affected by rising in temperature. For example, as I said, jerboa, rodent, desert snail, and some other insects. Give reasons. Some animals make estivation to overcome extreme rise in temperature and overcome shortage of water and rain, especially in desert area. Animals that hibernate or estivate store an amount of food as fats in their bodies to provide them with energy, because as we said, they will dormant and stop their activities, so they need energy. They store fats in their bodies, which will provide them with energy needed to keep their life during the period of dormancy. Fats other than other kind of foods by production of a large amount of water on their reusing. So these animals store food and water together in the form of fats. Now we'll talk about birds' migration. Some species of birds are adapted to environmental conditions by migration from cold and polar regions. Because they live in cold and polar region during winter, they searching for more lighted and warmer regions for reproduction or to lay their eggs. Birds migration, it's inherited. Inherited means the whole family, the grandfathers, the parents, and even the small birds, all of them, they do this behavior. It's inherited from generation to another. Inherited means it's inherited behavior from generation to another. In some species of birds, where they migrate from cold and polar region, searching for what? For more lighted and warmer region. For reproduction means lay eggs. Some species of birds adapted to environmental condition by migration. They migrate to the same place at the same time every year. They do this behavior every year. These birds inherit this behavior where they migrate into the same place at the same time every year. And then they will return back by the spring. When the climate condition becomes favorable, in the spring when the climate condition become favorable, these birds return back to their original habitat. For example, quail bird. Quail bird in winter. Some species of birds such as quail birds migrate from cold and polar region to lighted and warmer place for reproduction or to lay their day eggs. But as I said, in spring, when the climate conditions become favorable, it's warm, these birds return back to its original habitat. And this is a kind of behavioral adaptation. Number 4, adaptation in hiding, or it's called camouflage. Camouflage, some animals can color themselves with the dominant color of the environment, so they hide from their enemies. Camouflage, it is the ability of some living organisms to be hidden from their enemies, to capture the prey to hide from enemies, or to capture the prey in the predatory species. For example, leaf insects. It's hardly to be discovered by their enemies because it looks like the plant leaf exactly in the color and the shape of wings, and this is a structural adaptation. Stick insect, it's hardly to be discovered by its enemies because it looks like the branch of the plants as well. They look like the branch of the plant. Chameleon, chameleon color itself with dominant color of the environment to be hidden from its prey of insects, to capture them and feed on them. The last part in our lesson is camel is the desert sheep. Camel is considered one of the most adapted animals to live in the desert. It's also considered an example for structural, functional, behavioral adaptation that help them to live in the hard condition of the desert. Thank you, my students.